On a single afternoon, sitting in a borrowed fishing boat, Jesus told 7 stories that would never stop being argued about. The crowd was so dense they were standing in the shallows of the lake. He had pushed off from the shore just far enough that his voice would carry across the water without anyone touching him. Earlier that same morning, he had been accused of casting out demons by the prince of demons. By the afternoon, he had stopped speaking plainly. He sat down in the boat, which was the formal posture of a teacher in his time. Then he began the longest single block of parables in any of the 4 Gospels, 7 of them, given in one sitting, in one location, in one shape. Matthew gathered them all into a single chapter for a reason. The order was not random, and the audience was not constant. The first 4 parables were given to the crowd from the boat. The last 3 were given only to the disciples, after Jesus left the beach and went inside a house. That shift is the structural key to the entire afternoon. Most teachers walk through these 7 parables as if they were 7 separate sermons. They were not. They were one sermon with 7 angles, deliberately ordered, deliberately split between 2 audiences. The first one is the only one Jesus had to explain. And he explained it because the disciples missed what it was actually about. The Sower. The parable opens with a Galilean farmer broadcasting seed across an unplowed field, scattering it by hand before the soil was turned. This is not a parable about the seed. It is a parable about the 4 soils. The seed is identical in every case, thrown by the same hand on the same afternoon. What changes is the ground it lands on. Some of it falls on the path where the earth is packed hard from foot traffic and the seed never sinks in. Some falls on rocky soil where there is just enough dirt to germinate but no depth for roots. Some falls among thorns, which choke the young plant before it ever produces grain. And some falls on good soil, where it yields 30, 60, or 100 times what was sown. Most readers assume the parable is a strategy lecture for the sower. It is not. Jesus does not say the sower failed. He does not say the sower should have aimed better. He says 3 of the 4 soils were already what they were before the seed arrived. The parable is a diagnostic, not an evangelism technique. It is asking the listener what kind of ground they are. Every person standing in the shallows that afternoon was being sorted by the very first story Jesus told. The crowd heard a farming parable. The disciples heard their first lesson in how Jesus would teach for the rest of the day. The next parable answers the question the disciples were too afraid to ask out loud. Why does God let the wrong things grow? The wheat and the weeds. Picture a field of young green wheat in early Galilean summer, the rows still ankle-high, with darnel coming up between them. Darnel is a weed that looks identical to wheat until the heads form. Sabotaging an enemy's field by sowing darnel into it was a known act of agricultural revenge in the ancient Near East. Roman law eventually made it a specific crime. This is not a parable about evil people inside the church. It is a parable about why God delays judgment. The servants in the story see the weeds and ask the obvious question, should we go pull them out now? The owner refuses, and his reason is the entire point. He does not say he cannot tell the wheat from the weeds. He says that pulling the weeds would damage the wheat because the roots are tangled together below the surface. Patience is not God being slow or distracted. Patience is God protecting the real from the cost of premature judgment. Every honest person eventually asks why the world stays broken for so long. The answer Jesus gives is not that God is unaware of the brokenness. The answer is that the harvest has a timing, and the timing is set by mercy. The crowd heard a story about a farmer's strange decision. The disciples heard the answer to a question they had been carrying for months. The third parable answers a different question. What does the kingdom even look like when it starts? The mustard seed. Imagine a single black mustard seed in the palm of a hand, smaller than a pinhead, almost too small to pick up without licking your finger first. Black mustard, Brassica nigra, was the smallest seed any Galilean farmer planted. In one Galilean season, it could grow 8 to 10 feet tall, woody enough at the base for birds to perch on the branches. Most teachers stop at the size contrast. Small seed becomes big plant. That is not what is shocking about this parable. The shocking part is the imagery in the second half. In the prophetic literature, in Daniel and Ezekiel, a great tree with birds nesting in its branches is the standard image for an empire. Nebuchadnezzar's empire is a tree with birds in its branches. Pharaoh's Egypt is a tree with birds in its branches. When Jesus says the mustard plant becomes a place where the birds of the air come and perch, he is using imperial imagery. He is using the language of empire for something that starts in dirt. This kingdom does not arrive the way an empire arrives. It does not march in. It does not announce itself with horns and banners in conquered cities. It arrives like a seed nobody can see and ends up looking like the empires it replaces. Every movement that has reshaped history started smaller than the people watching it noticed. The disciples standing on the beach that afternoon were 11 men and a tax collector. A century later, their movement would be reshaping the empire that crucified their teacher. The fourth parable is the shortest one Jesus tells all afternoon, and it is the one that scandalizes a first-century audience the most. The leaven. A woman is mixing yeast into 3 measures of flour, about 50 pounds of it, enough bread to feed 100 people. That detail is not incidental. It is a feast-sized batch, not a household batch. In Jewish symbolism, leaven almost always meant corruption. At Passover, every trace of leaven had to be removed from the house, hunted down with candles, and burned. Jesus calls the kingdom of heaven leaven. He uses the name of the thing his audience was taught to throw away. That reframe is the parable. There is one more detail almost every reader skips. The text says, "The woman hid the leaven in the dough." The Greek verb is the same one Jesus will use 2 parables later for the hidden treasure. The kingdom works invisibly. It is mixed in before anyone sees the bread rise. By the time the dough has changed, you cannot find the leaven anymore. You can only see what it has done. The kingdom does not announce itself. It does not put up signs. It works through the dough before anyone notices the rising. At this point, Jesus leaves the crowd and goes inside a house. The next 3 parables are only for the disciples. The hidden treasure. Picture a day laborer working someone else's field, his shovel striking something solid in the dirt. In the ancient Near East, treasure burial was a survival reflex during war. When invaders were coming, you buried what you owned and hoped to dig it up again afterward. Often, the owner never came back. The fields of Galilee were dotted with forgotten caches. The man in the parable does something that should bother us, and Jesus does not correct it. He covers the treasure back up. He goes and sells everything he owns. He buys the field. Most readers walk past the strangeness because the parable is so short. Look closer at one phrase. He sells everything with joy. The cost is not a sacrifice in his mind. The cost is a bargain. Most teaching on this parable describes the kingdom as something you give things up for, as if the giving up were the point. That is not what Jesus is describing. He is describing a man who has just realized the math is bent in his favor. The kingdom is not what you give up things for. It is what makes the giving up feel like winning. Every person who has tried to live this teaching as duty has misread the parable. Jesus is describing joy, not discipline. The 6th parable looks almost identical to the 5th. The difference between them is the entire point. The pearl of great price. Picture a merchant on a trade road between Damascus and Alexandria, holding a single pearl up to the light. In the Roman world, fine pearls were valued above gold. A single pearl could buy an estate. The merchant in the parable is not a tourist. He is a professional, a man whose entire career is recognizing quality. He has handled thousands of pearls in his life. He knows the second this one is in his hand that he has never seen anything like it. Notice the difference between this man and the laborer in the previous parable. The laborer was not looking. He stumbled on the treasure. The merchant was searching his entire life. Both end up selling everything. Both find the kingdom. This is the structural twist almost every teacher misses. These are not 2 versions of the same parable. They are 2 different kinds of finder. The kingdom finds the unprepared and the prepared by the same road. The seeker and the stumbler arrive at the same destination. The question is not whether you have been searching long enough to deserve it. The question is whether you recognize the pearl when it is in front of you. Some people will spend a lifetime looking and miss it. Some people will turn one shovel of dirt and find it. The 7th parable is the only one that ends with judgment, and it is the one Jesus tells last on purpose. The dragnet. 2 fishermen are dragging a long weighted net up the beach, the catch flopping in the sand. fish of every kind, edible and clean side by side. The Greek word is sajan, the commercial dragnet used in Galilean fishing, weighted at the bottom and floated at the top so it swept the lake floor as it was pulled. Whatever was in the water came up in the net. The sorting happened later, on shore. This is the wheat and weeds parable retold for fishermen. It is the same shape, the same patience, the same eventual sort. But there is one difference, and it is deliberate. The crowd that morning got the wheat and weeds version, with the patience emphasized and the harvest deferred. The disciples in the house get the dragnet version, with the sorting on the beach made explicit. Jesus saved the harder image for the people he was training to teach. Now, look at the shape of the entire afternoon. It began with a sower scattering seed across an unplowed field. It ends with a net dragging every kind of fish onto the sand. The kingdom starts wide and ends with a sort. Both ends of the day frame the same truth, just from different angles. The 7 parables are not 7 topics. They are one teaching with 7 angles. And the last angle is the one most modern teachers preach as if it were the first. Jesus then turns to the disciples and asks them a single question. Their answer is, the reason a verse most people skip is in the chapter at all. He asks them whether they have understood all of this. They say yes. What he says next is Matthew 13:52, and it almost never gets quoted. He tells them that every scribe trained for the kingdom of heaven is like a householder who brings out of his treasure things both new and old. That is what Jesus had just done. Old images, the sower and the field and the net and the harvest. Ancient pictures every Galilean had grown up with, turned on a single afternoon into something nobody had ever heard before. He gave the parable of the soil so people would know what kind of ground they were. He gave it on the same afternoon. He gave the parable of the wheat and the weeds so people would stop demanding a judgment that mercy was still delaying. He gave it on the same afternoon. He gave the parable of the mustard seed so people would stop expecting the kingdom to look like an empire. He gave it on the same afternoon. He gave the parable of the leaven so people would stop expecting the kingdom to announce itself. He gave it on the same afternoon. He gave the parable of the hidden treasure so people would stop treating the kingdom as a sacrifice instead of a bargain. He gave it on the same afternoon. He gave the parable of the pearl so people would know that seekers and stumblers arrive at the same destination. He gave it on the same afternoon. He gave the parable of the dragnet so the disciples would understand that patience now does not mean no sort later. He gave it on the same afternoon. 7 parables, 1 sitting, 1 borrowed boat in the morning, 1 private house in the afternoon. The shape of the day was the message. 4 parables for the crowd standing in the shallows, 3 parables for the disciples sitting on the floor of the house. Old images turned into new ones by a teacher who had been accused that very morning of working for the wrong side. Which of the 7 landed differently for you than you expected? Tell us which one in the comments and tell us why. If this changed the way you read Matthew 13, the next video walks through the chapter the disciples never saw coming.